Welcome to week 2, Gender and Sexual Diversity in Jewish Sacred Texts. So our goals for this lesson are to reflect on Jewish traditions of gender diversity, wrestle with traditional interpretations of prohibitions against LGBTQ identity, highlight affirming interpretations of these same texts, and understand the Jewish values related to inclusion. So we're going to start by covering some learnings that might be surprising to you. So the way in which Western culture has developed in many spaces, Jewish cultures, particularly those that were originated in Europe or around Europe, really kind of created this idea of this gender binary, that they're only men and women. However, that is not the only way in which human societies have structured their understandings of gender and the diversity therein. There are many cultures around the world that have more than 2 genders. Some have up to 3, 4, 5. Later on in the PowerPoint, there is a link to an example, to a map where you can look at some of those other cultures that have gender diversity with more than 2 genders. And it might surprise some of you to actually realize that in Jewish culture, we have a deep history of understanding that people did not always fit neatly into this gender binary category. And that's what I want to start our conversation for this week about. So just some basic background on some Jewish texts first. In case, as we go through this lesson, you might be unfamiliar with some of these terms. So the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, would be the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. The Mishnah, edited around the 2nd century of the Common Era, it's a compilation of what had been oral traditions establishing laws and practices which were based on rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. The Talmud, the rabbis and scholars recorded their conversations and disagreements about the laws of the Mishnah, contains conversations within and across generations. In addition to the legal issues, the rabbis of the Talmud tell stories about their teachers and their students and present interpretations of biblical stories and texts. These included contributions from 200 of the Common Era to 600 of the Common Era. And the Midrash is a genre of rabbinic literature. It was produced in the same circles as the Talmud, but not included in the Talmud. The subject of this literature is non-legal, posing and answering questions that are suggested by the texts of the Torah and the Bible. This literature begins around the same time as the Talmud, but continues for another 2 to 3 centuries after the Talmud is closed. So in all of these collections of our sacred texts, you will find terms for what we might consider now gender identities that you might be surprised to know exist. This is not to apply anachronistically some type of modern understanding of the relationship of gender identity in our bodies, but rather what I think this highlights is that the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah saw people in their communities that did not fit neatly into this gender binary system that was the predominant norm, right? And so what they have here are 6 genders that we would consider gender diversity, for lack of a better term, in our language. These are not terms that match one-to-one with our terms that we went over in the last week's lesson, but rather these are how they were thinking about it. And as we navigate this, I recognize that these aren't going to be the most affirming interpretations for all of them. And what I hope we can ground ourselves in is instead this idea that LGBTQ identity and folks that fit outside of the gender binary are not some invention of the modern age, but rather have been around in our communities forever. And it's really up to us to wrestle with what does it mean for us to build a big enough tent that can hold all of these people. So the terms in front of you are the terms in our sacred text that we are going to be talking about. So the first 2 is Zechar and Nekeva, usually translated as male and female into English. So those are the terms that maybe you are more familiar with or wouldn't be surprised to see. The next 4, though, are the ones that we want to focus on. So the androgynos is a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. And for all of these were not just like one-off references in the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Midrash, but rather hundreds of references to discuss these individuals, right? Androgynos comes from the Greek word andro and gyno, which means man and woman. Then we have the tumtum, a person who has sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured. In the Talmud, the tumtum has indeterminate genitals. 181 references in the Mishnah and Talmud, and 335 in classical Midrash and Jewish codes. The alonit, a person who is identified as female at birth, but develops male characteristics at puberty and is infertile. 80 references in the Mishnah and Talmud, 40 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. And then Asaris, a person who is identified as male at birth, but develops female characteristics at puberty or later. Asaris is considered male, but has no penis or very small penis. Asaris can be naturally Asaris or become one through human intervention. This status is also known as a eunuch. 156 references in the Mishnah and Talmud, 379 in classical Midrash and Jewish law codes. So now what I want to do is go through a few of the examples that were pulled that illuminate some of how the rabbis were wrestling and using these words in relationship to our text and tradition. So the first one that I'm going to lift up relates to the story of the creation of human beings. And oftentimes when I educate folks around this in other environments, and if you are maybe in this room with me, I might pose the question first, if I were to ask you, tell me the story of the creation of human beings, what would you tell me? And more often than not, the answer that comes to mind is Adam and Eve, right? So the story of Adam as the first human, the first man who came first and named everybody in the Garden of Eden was, then you have the story of Lilith, but then also the more well-known story of Eve coming from his rib, and then from that, kind of a lot of other more problematic issues of patriarchy, misogyny come to play as well. And so what it might be surprising to learn or to reframe and refocus is that that's actually not the first time that humans are mentioned as being created. The first time is in the very first chapter of Genesis, of the book of the Torah, and this is the sentence that is in the Torah. So it says, God created the first Adam, the first human being, in God's own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, God created them. So the rabbis of the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Midrash understood that there were no words at a place, that everything was in the Torah for a reason. And so when they looked at this passage, they wrestled with it because there was one person, there was two people, there was masculine, there was feminine, singular, plural. What's going on here, right? So if we break this down, Adam is a Hebrew word that comes from the root word meaning earth, right? So it's just a being of the earth. And we know that Hebrew is a binary gendered language and that each word has to have a masculine or feminine ending. And so Adam just had a masculine ending, which then came to be this like personified man, this first primordial man. Right, and so instead what they're offering is when the Holy One, blessed be the one, created the first Adam, that first human, God created him an androgynous, right? And so this person, this first human, and this is the first time that Betzel Elohim, the idea that we're all made in the image of God, is lifted up. What if perhaps that first human was this androgynous being, right? This person that had a combination of male, female, what we would consider male, female sexual characteristics. How powerful could that be if we centered this story of creation, right? How powerful could it be for the trans non-binary young people in our communities who could see themselves reflected in the divine? The divine is reflected back at them. For me, it opens up the possibility of a more resplendent and complicated and all-gendered understanding of the divine. For me, and I know for many other people, picturing God as this older man with a beard is not really helpful, or as this one thing that's maybe masculine and a king is not helpful. We know what that is, right? We know what kings are like. So this all gendered, beyond our comprehension, non-gendered, agendered is what our divine is, and that in and of itself is a reflection of us, right? And so how powerful could that be for any of us, that all of us have these gender traits within us, and no matter how that presents itself, that is still a reflection of the divine. So the next one, this next text is from the Midrash, and again, it's wrestling with trying to fit this androgynous person into their existing structures in their community of men and women. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the back and forth because you'll see that it's not a particularly affirming way of thinking about people, and like, well, in this way it's like a man, and this way it's like a woman. But what I really want to focus on is the fourth one. It says, how is he like both men and women? Guilt is incurred for killing him or for cursing him, as is in the case for men and women. One who unwittingly slays him must go into exile. Excuse me. And one who intentionally slays him receives the death penalty. He inherits in all cases of inheritance like both men and women. And so what I think is really powerful about this passage is that even though that these people might be not part of the dominant group or outside of their typical traditional understandings of gender, they still have worth as human beings, right? They're still, you cannot kill them, you cannot curse them, you cannot put them into exile. You cannot slay them, even unintentionally. They're still valued and they're still a human being. I think even if you see in the present day, marginalized folks are often seen as less than human. And so what I think here, what's really powerful to ground ourselves in is that even though the rabbis were wrestling with how to fit these folks into their understanding of the world, they still valued their place as humans and as a place at the table. And I think that's a really powerful lesson that we can also remember, is that just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not worth wrestling with. And again, here's another example of how a tumtum and androgynous was discussed. And here, genderqueer ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, right? What I think is really powerful about this particular passage is that it really puts into perspective that the story of Abraham and Sarah is a story that actually tracks really well to folks that have trans non-binary experiences, right? So when we think about Abraham and Sarah, when we first meet them, we know them as Abraham and Sarai. They undergo a physical, spiritual transformation. They come out of that experience with a new name and a new identity, and it's with that new identity that they fulfill their destiny, right? Which tracks very well to and relates to experiences that trans non-binary folks might have, right? They were assigned an identity when they were born. They know themselves to be something not that. They undergo a process of transformation, of transition, maybe perhaps come out of that process with a new name and a more authentic identity. And it's by that identity with which they can really fulfill their destiny. So how powerful could it be if we opened up the possibility of giving trans non-binary folks a reflection of themselves in the matriarch and patriarch of our tradition, right? And you'll see here the rabbis kind of offering, well, perhaps Abraham and Sarah were a tumtum and an Elohim, right? Again, just think about how powerful could this be, how life-saving this could be. And then lastly, this last text, I want to focus on the third stanza. It says, and as for the Sarises who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire and who hold fast to my covenants, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not perish. Right, and what I think is really interesting about this passage is when we think about the conversations that were happening around marriage equality in particular, or just norms around intimacy and relationships and what a relationships are valid or not, oftentimes the defense against marriages or the attack against marriage equality was, well, marriages are for the purposes of creating children, right? Be fruitful and multiply is one of the first commandments that is given in the Torah to the human race, to the human species. And here we have an example of an individual who cannot fulfill maybe that commandment, but can fulfill other ones. They can keep the Sabbath. They can hold fast to the covenant. They are righteous. And that in and of itself means that God is going to lift them up with a monument better than sons or daughters, right? How powerful is that statement? That sons and daughters are supposed to be the be-all, end-all as this commandment, but here we have somebody they maybe can't fulfill that in the same way, but can fulfill the mitzvot and commandments in other ways, and even kind of reach a level of praise in the kingdom of heaven, more so than somebody that might have sons or daughters, right? So I think that's, again, really powerful for the role that people that in our communities, that just because they might not have a certain narrative or their life story might result in different outcomes, that doesn't mean that they're not worthy of being desired, especially when we're in communities that are very much focused on young people and family structures. Just because somebody might be an individual or not have that same end goal doesn't mean that they shouldn't be honored for being worthy of inclusion. So in addition to gender diversity, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the traditional prohibitions that are used against folks that are different in terms of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and offer perhaps some reframing or different interpretations that you could use if you were ever faced with some pushback in this area, right? So obviously Leviticus 18:22 is probably the most obvious and glaring, and with a male you shall not lie the lines of a woman, it is abhorrent, right? So this idea that being LGBTQ, homosexuality, and more broadly LGBTQ identity is a sin, right? And that's a really hard one to wrestle with. And so what you have started to see folks do, clergy, other spiritual leaders, are offer both a direct confrontation of this is in our tradition and we need to accept that, and also kind of reframing the interpretations for our understanding that is allowing us to kind of both honor what we know and what we value and the tradition that exists, right? So What you see here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what this rabbi is offering is that it's reframing what is the prohibition based on what the rest of the chapter and the verses are talking about, right? So it's here he's offering about the power relationships at play, right? And that what is actually the sin is when somebody is not coming together in a loving way, but that's more about power or right. So those are the same types of heterosexual relationships described that as condemned are all power relationships. So really reframing this by saying that is when it's abhorrent, is when there is no kind of intimacy or connection, but rather it's just for kind of power. So that's one potential possibility, right? And another challenging piece of Torah is the prohibition against cross-dressing from Deuteronomy. There shall be no man's item on a woman, and a man shall not wear a woman's garment. For anyone who does these things is abhorrent to God, right? So again, how do we wrestle with this, especially as it relates to trans inclusion? So here we have an offering from Rabbi Elliot Kukla and Reuben Zellman that talk about actually you could think of this, and there is an interpretation of this that actually is affirming of trans identity, that calls upon trans non-binary folks to wear the clothing that is affirming of who they are, right? Some people feel like their true gender is not the gender that was assigned to them at birth. The Torah is asking us not to misrepresent our gender, which we can understand as using external garments to conceal our inner selves, right? So it's actually saying that to come out as trans, to be your true self, that is actually a commandment, and you are called upon by Jewish tradition to do that. The Torah wants us to be true to ourselves. Again, if you're ever faced with this type of pushback, perhaps offering this as a reinterpretation for those people. In addition to our text, we also have very strong values towards inclusion that I want to go through. So at Keshet, we lift up 7 values in particular that we feel are inherently Jewish and have to be present for any community to consider itself Jewish. So the first would be kavod, respect, right? Judaism teaches us to treat ourselves and others with respect. Even the stranger is to be treated with respect. Kavod is a feeling or of regard for the rights, dignity, feelings, wishes, and abilities of other. Teasing and name-calling disrespect and hurt everyone, so learn to respect people's differences, right? So maybe start thinking to yourself, what are some actions that are related to treating people with respect as it is explicitly connected to LGBTQ inclusion, right? This is using people's correct pronouns and names. These are avoiding using slurs, of respecting people's identities as they share them with you, respecting the dignity of them as human beings, even if they maybe don't fit into your prior conceptions of gender. Shalom Bayit, peace in the home. Our community centers, synagogues, youth groups, and camps are often our second home. Everyone needs to feel comfortable, safe, and respected at home. Don't ostracize those who seem different. Strive to settle disagreements in peaceful and respectful ways that allow all community members to maintain their dignity. Right? So if we want people to be comfortable in our spaces, that means making sure that they have access to spaces to fulfill their needs. So having an all-gender bathroom available. So everybody, regardless of their gender identity, have a safe place to go to the bathroom. That means maybe not always preferencing the more conservative voices in the space and trying to figure out, is there a different principle or identity or value that we can organize ourselves around, right? Like we'll talk about later how, yes, there are lots of prohibitions and laws in the Torah, but the greatest one is the sanctity of human life. So how can we create spaces that honor life and the real risk that LGBTQ young people in particular are at when they're not included by their religious community, their faith community, in a way that is still respectful to those that maybe aren't there yet in the full understanding of what it means to be an LGBTQ inclusive space. That means peace in the home could also mean having visible markers of inclusion. So rainbow stickers or safe zone stickers or pride flags, things of this nature. We talked already about this idea that we're all made in God's image, B'Tselem Elohim, right? So that means treating people that way. That means treating people as equal and affirming and celebrating our LGBTQ folks' life experiences in the same way. So perhaps it's changing your B'nai Mitzvah ceremony to call it, instead of a bar bat mitzvah, to call it a B'nai Mitzvah or a Bim Mitzvah or a Simchas Mitzvah. That means perhaps changing how you call somebody up to the Torah. That's more authentic to who they are, instead of a son or daughter, maybe saying child of or house of, for example. That means maybe having life cycle ritual events for coming out, for transitioning, really lifting up and holding and affirming the unique experiences of LGBTQ individuals. Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bazeh, communal responsibility. This idea that all Israel is responsible for each other means each of us must take action and inspire others to create a community in which we can all take pride. That means not standing idly by when LGBTQ individual civil rights are under attack. That means that even if you aren't sure how this relates to you directly, knowing that this impacts other Jewish people in your community calls upon us to work to make ourselves more inclusive. Guarding our use of language, Shmirat Haloshon. The Talmud warns us that we must take care in how we use language. Talking about others behind their backs, even if what we are saying is true, is prohibited. The guidelines for Shmirat Haloshon remind us that what we say about others affects them in ways we can never predict. Words can hurt or heal depending on how we use them, right? Words are really important. We are part of a tradition where the universe was spoken into existence, right? Let there be light. That's how powerful words are, right? So that's using the correct terminology, navigating changing pronouns and our own feelings of how do we correct ourselves when we make a mistake, realizing that it is, even if our intention is not to hurt somebody, that if that impact did cause that person harm, that we really need to rectify that and apologize and correct ourselves and commit to doing better the next time. Love your neighbor as yourself. So Rabbi Hillel once said that this is the foundational value of the Torah. It begins with loving ourselves. We must love and accept our full selves, and in doing so, create the capacity for extending that love and acceptance to others. I think sometimes this, for me, this very much relates to allyship and treating people the way that we would want to be treated. Sometimes that would require really challenging our deeply held beliefs about gender and sexual norms that aren't serving us anymore. And recognizing that perhaps sometimes we're reacting out of anger or confusion because we are afraid of being vulnerable. And part of this is being vulnerable about the ways in which perhaps the gender binary has impacted us and kept us from being our true selves. Being honest with each other, having conversation, being in conversation with each other, even when it's hard. Al tifrosh min hatzibor, solidarity. Don't separate yourself from the community. So when you feel different from others in your community, don't isolate yourself. Find allies and supporters who you can talk to. If you know someone who's feeling isolated, reach out, be an ally and a friend, right? This really speaks to this idea that we're all in this together and that we have a responsibility to be each other's keepers, as we are taught in the Torah as well. So if you see somebody struggling or you see an injustice happening in your community, really speaking up and being an ally, and this really calls upon us to be that ally for other people. There are other values in addition that we hold true in the Jewish community, right? So you cannot stand by your fellow's blood. There are other teachings that says if you see a person in a life-threatening situation, one has an obligation to do something in order to save them, right? If somebody humiliates another in public, it's like you shed their blood. Again, this idea that words have power, and it's just as much harmful as like actual physical violence. One of my favorite passages from the Torah is from Deuteronomy, where it says, "Therefore cut away the thickening around your hearts and stiffen your necks no more. For your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. God is the great, mighty, and feared God who does not consider personal standing and accepts no bribe, but upholds the rights of the orphan and widow and stranger. You too shall love the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt." Right? What I love about this is that so often we are called to the space of empathy, right? But because of our own history as a people of being slaves in Egypt, we know what it feels to be different, to be other, to be treated badly because of it, to be oppressed because of it. So how can we do the same thing to other people because we have that shared experience together, right? So we are called upon to love the stranger because we ourselves have been strangers too. And at the same time, our tradition knows that this is hard, right? Cut away the thickening around your hearts and stiffen your necks no more. This is hard work and it requires us to do the hard work. And by doing this work, it is allowing us to become a more authentically Jewish community. So with that, your activities for the week are for your discussion prompt. I'm just curious, did you know about the different genders in the Talmud? If not, what does it feel like to learn about this part of our history? And if so, what new perspectives have you learned by studying these texts? Your assignment, using a Jewish text, tradition, and values as a guide, maybe write a 1 or 2 page practice how you would move someone to work towards greater LGBTQ inclusion with your own voice. How would you use these values-based frameworks to impact change? And then for some additional readings or some more ideas about this, check out Torah Queries, which is a collection of each Torah portion, but told with a queer perspective, and what kind of queer lessons can we learn from this? And that lastly, that link is to other cultures around the world that have gender diverse cultures that are beyond just the gender binary. So I hope you find this week interesting, and I look forward to reading your responses And until next week.